It was 1949. In the far northwest of Scotland, there was an island the modern world had almost completely forgotten. Lewis, swept by Atlantic winds, home to fishermen and farmers with deep Presbyterian roots. A community that knew the Bible, yet watched, year after year, as the younger generation quietly slipped away from the faith. Not through scandal, not through open rebellion. Through something worse, silent indifference. The pastors could see it, the elders could feel it, but nobody knew what to do. And then two elderly sisters, Peggy, 84 years old, and Christine, 82, decided they weren't going to accept that in silence. One could barely get out of bed. The other had severe arthritis. From a human standpoint, they were the last people you'd ever expect to change anything. But they started to pray, and what happened next shook an entire island. What you're about to see isn't legend. It isn't religious exaggeration. It's one of the most well-documented revivals of the 20th century, the Hebrides revival, which began in 1949, on that island, in that room, with those two women. Within just a few weeks, something nobody had planned was already happening. People waking up in the middle of the night with an unexplainable restlessness. Walking to the churches without really knowing what was drawing them there. Young people being converted in fields, on roads, on fishing boats, an entire community being turned completely upside down. Have you ever prayed like that, in the dark, with no visible results, with heaven feeling completely shut? Then this story is for you. If you want to live a prayer life that truly moves heaven, I've put together something special. The ebook, The Power of Prayer, a complete guide to help you discover the real power of prayer. Just like these women who got on their knees and shook a nation. The link is in the first pinned comment down below. And before we dive into this story, go ahead and write in the comments, Lord, ignite in me the fire of true prayer. To understand the weight of what happened in 1949, you first need to understand what Lewis was. The Isle of Lewis sits in the Outer Hebrides archipelago, off the northwest coast of Scotland. It's a land of rugged, raw scenery, open bogs, heavy skies, winds that don't ask permission. The people there lived off fishing and subsistence farming, in small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone, and where life revolved around simple cycles: work, family, church. And that last word, church, carried enormous weight on that island. Lewis was one of the last strongholds of the most conservative Scottish Presbyterianism. The tradition of the Lord's Day Sunday, kept with an almost medieval seriousness, was still practiced there long after the rest of Scotland had already let it go. No commerce on Sundays. No entertainment. It was a set-apart day, period. The Bible was read at home. Hymns were sung as a family. Attending worship wasn't optional. It was part of the very structure of life. That heritage had been forged in fire. In the 19th century, Lewis had experienced a significant revival under the ministry of Robert Finlayson and other preachers. The memory of that spiritual movement still lived in the older generation, not as nostalgia, but as a living reference point for how God had moved before and could move again. But there was a visible fracture. World War II had taken the young men and women of Lewis off the island, to the battlefields of Europe, to Royal Navy ships, to a world completely different from the one they'd grown up in. Many came back. But they came back different. The war had shaken certainties, exposed these young people to other ways of life, other philosophies, other values. And what had once been simply taken for granted, the faith, the religious practice, the spiritual rhythm of the community, now had to be actively chosen, and many weren't choosing it. It wasn't a loud rebellion. There were no young people preaching atheism on the street corners of Stornoway, the island's main town. It was something harder to fight, a gradual distance, a growing coldness, a generation that still knew the hymns by heart but had lost the fire on the inside. The island's pastors noticed. The church elders noticed. In 1949, Reverend James Murray Mackay, pastor of the Free Church of Scotland in Barvas, one of the inland villages of Lewis, carried that weight with particular intensity. He could see the spiritual state of his congregation, and he knew that preaching alone wouldn't be enough. Something needed to change, something that was beyond any human ability to produce. And it was right then that he heard about two sisters. Peggy and Christine Smith lived in a simple house in the village of Barvas. Peggy was 84 years old. Christine was 82. They were faithful members of Mackay's congregation, but for years they hadn't been able to attend services. Peggy was bedridden. Christine suffered from severe arthritis. To the world, they were two forgotten old women on a forgotten island, invisible. But Reverend Mackay knew that those two women prayed, not casually, not as a ritual. They spent entire nights in prayer, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning, crying out to God for the island, for the young people, for the community they loved and watched slipping away. And one day, Peggy Smith sent a message to Pastor Mackay. She had received an assurance, a conviction she couldn't explain any other way, that God was about to visit Lewis, that a revival was coming, and that the condition for it was that the church's leaders would humble themselves before God and seek His face with real seriousness. Mackay took the message seriously. He called together the congregation's elders and deacons for nights of prayer meetings, held twice a week in a barn near the church, lasting from midnight into the early hours of the morning. Simple men on their knees, crying out to God for their families, their children, their community. Months went by. Nothing extraordinary happened. But they kept going. And this is where the story starts to get really interesting. Because what was being built in those quiet nights in that barn, in that bedroom with two elderly sisters, was a spiritual pressure that would soon no longer fit within 4 walls. The fire was being lit. While the elders prayed in the barn, Peggy and Christine Smith prayed in their room. Night after night, week after week, 2 women who could barely move, bending their knees or simply stretching out their hands from where they lay and crying out to God for the island they loved. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. No music, no crowd, just 2 old voices in a cold room in a forgotten corner of the North Atlantic. But there was a quality to that prayer that few people can describe with any precision. Duncan Campbell, the preacher who would later become a central instrument of the revival, would hear about those nights afterward and say that Peggy and Christine prayed with a certainty he had rarely encountered anywhere. It wasn't vague, hopeful prayer. It was active faith. They quoted the promise of Isaiah 44:3, "I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground," and prayed as though the answer was already on its way. And then, on one of those nights, something shifted. Peggy Smith had a vision, or a deep conviction, as she herself would describe it, that God was about to act, that the revival would come, and that there was a man God had prepared to be the instrument of that movement. She didn't know his name, but she described what she had sensed to Pastor Mackay with such clear conviction that he couldn't ignore it. Mackay reached out to the Faith Mission, a Scottish evangelistic organization, and asked them to send a preacher to Lewis. The name that came back was Duncan Campbell. Campbell was an experienced man. He had a background in preaching and had seen God move in other places. But when he received the invitation, he had already made other commitments and declined. The answer came back to Mackay. Campbell couldn't come. When Peggy heard, she was direct. "He will come. God told me that's the man." Weeks later, through circumstances that Campbell would describe as clearly providential, his other commitments were canceled, and he accepted the invitation. In December of 1949, Duncan Campbell arrived on Lewis. He had come for a 10-day series of meetings. He would stay for 2 years. But what nobody knew yet, not Campbell, not Mackay, not even Peggy, was that the fire about to fall wouldn't follow any human script. It wouldn't respect schedules or programs or the 4 walls of any church. Heaven was about to open over Lewis, and when it did, nobody was completely ready for what came. The first week of meetings was, in Duncan Campbell's own words, disappointing. People came. They listened. They went home. There was no special movement, no extraordinary response. Campbell preached with sincerity, but he could feel that something was dammed up, as if there were an invisible barrier between the words and the hearts. 10 days was the agreed time frame. And those 10 days were almost up. On the last scheduled night, Campbell preached and closed the service. People started to leave. Everything pointed to the meetings ending right there, with nothing extraordinary to report. That's when a young deacon, a simple man with no title or position of prominence, stood up. He opened the Bible to Psalm 24 and read aloud, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart." Then he closed the book, looked at Campbell, and said something that would never be forgotten. How long are we going to ask God to do what He's already asked us to do? We need to have clean hands. And then he dropped to his knees and began to pray. Campbell would later describe that, in that moment, it felt as though the very ceiling of the church had disappeared. A presence came down over that room in a way he had never experienced before with such intensity. People who were already on their way out stopped in their tracks. Some fell to their knees right there in the aisle. Others began to weep without being able to explain why. The meeting that was supposed to have ended kept going, right on through the night. And outside, something even more inexplicable was happening. People who weren't in the church at all, who were at home, asleep, or simply walking through the village, began to be overtaken by a sudden, overwhelming conviction. Men knocked on the church door in the middle of the night, asking what they needed to do to be saved. A group of young people who had left a dance that very same night was intercepted not by any person, but by a presence they couldn't name, and they arrived at the church trembling, seeking God. Campbell walked out of the church in the early hours of that morning and found the village of Barvas wide awake. There were people gathered out on the roads. There were men sitting on their doorsteps, heads in their hands. There was an atmosphere that he would describe with a single word: holy. The meetings didn't end that night. They continued the next night, and the night after that. Campbell stayed for weeks, then months. The revival spread from village to village across the island, without anyone needing to organize anything. People simply showed up, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes after a long walk, drawn by something they couldn't describe, but recognized as real. And the more the fire spread, the more unlikely the instruments God chose to fuel it became. What happened in the weeks that followed is going to surprise you. Duncan Campbell wasn't the only one preaching. That's one of the most fascinating and most overlooked details of the Hebrides revival. The movement didn't depend on a single man, a single church, or a single denomination. It spread organically, almost uncontrollably, from village to village, like fire across a dry field. On some occasions, Campbell would arrive at a new village and discover the revival had already gotten there before him. People were already gathering, already being converted, already seeking God without any preacher having shown up yet. The work was already underway when he walked through the door. There was one particular night in the village of Arnold that Campbell would describe over and over again throughout his life. The meetings there had started, but without the same fire as in Barvas. There was resistance, there was coldness, and then a man, a simple farmer, with no theological training whatsoever, began to pray. Campbell said he had never heard anyone pray quite like that. The man prayed with an intimacy with God that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. And as he prayed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Campbell described feeling the house literally tremble, and shortly after, the revival broke over Arnold the same way it had broken over Barvas. The results were concrete and well documented. Hundreds of people were converted over the 2 years the revival lasted. These weren't shallow decisions made under the emotional pressure of a campaign. Many of these conversions happened in places completely outside of any religious meeting, on fishing boats, on roads, in homes, in fields, people being overtaken by a deep conviction of sin and a genuine hunger for God, with no preacher present at all. The social transformation was equally visible. In some communities, public behavior changed in a remarkable way. Campbell reported that in certain villages, the whole feel of community life had been altered. There was a seriousness, a kindness, a collective awareness of God's presence that people could actually sense when they walked into those places. Brothers and sisters, this was not the product of human strategy. There was no communications team, no advertising campaign, no organizational structure behind any of it. There was prayer. 3. There was faithful preaching, and there was a God who had decided to respond. The revival in the Hebrides burned most intensely through 1952, with smaller waves continuing well beyond that. Duncan Campbell would return to the island on other occasions, and new spiritual movements would be recorded there in the decades that followed. The soil of that island had been marked by something that doesn't just fade away. The Hebrides revival didn't start with a plan. It didn't start at a conference. It didn't start with a famous preacher. It didn't start with any kind of structure at all. It started with two women nobody was paying attention to. Peggy and Christine Smith never preached publicly. They never wrote books. When the fire fell on Lewis, they stayed exactly where they were, in a small room, in a simple house. And yet, what came out of that room shook an entire community. Duncan Campbell, who lived through every detail of that revival up close, left behind an observation that has stayed with history. The secret of the Hebrides wasn't method. It wasn't talent. It was a church that had reached the point of taking God absolutely seriously, in prayer, in holiness, in the real expectation that He acts and responds. And here's the question this story leaves with you. Have you been taking God that seriously? Lewis, in 1949, proves that revival isn't some relic of the past. It's God's response to the genuine prayer of ordinary people who refuse to accept the way things are as final. And between the impossible and the miracle, there's very often just one thing: someone willing to pray. If this story stirred something inside you, write in the comments, "Lord, use me as an instrument of your revival." That's my way of knowing you made it all the way to the end. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.